we are going to talk about how to monitor conversations in closed spaces today. If you're not familiar with us, we are First Draft. We are a global nonprofit that has bureaus in the UK and Australia and New York City. We help provide tools and knowledge for people and organizations to fight harmful and misleading information. So today we're talking about how to monitor in closed spaces. This is our agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about closed groups and messaging apps, why we think about them in the first place. I'm going to talk about the ethics of monitoring, which is a really important topic when it comes to being in these spaces. And then we're going to talk about some quick search tips. So basically our team's top tips when we're looking at these spaces. Once again, I am Shayden Arabani. I'm First Draft Partnerships and Programs Manager based in New York City. That's my Twitter handle if you want to follow me on Twitter and get in touch. And we will also have some information about the organization at the very end of this presentation in case you would like to get in touch with anyone there in those ways. So let's get started. Let's talk about closed groups and messaging apps. So why is this a concern when it comes to misinformation? Why does our org think about closed groups and messaging apps? Well, one of the reasons is that it is a huge way that people all over the world communicate. So WhatsApp has 2 billion users at this point. Facebook Messenger has 1.3 billion users. WeChat, which is another one of the most popular platforms in the world, is native to China. It is also really important to the Chinese-speaking diaspora community. We have platforms like KakaoTalk, which are native to Korea, and then Telegram, which used to be popular in Iran before it was blocked. Line is popular in Japan, Signal, and so many more. And these have increasingly become a way that people share information with their loved ones and with other people, and also consume news. Like I mentioned before, WeChat is important to the Chinese diaspora community. WhatsApp, for example, is very big with the Indian diaspora community, with Hispanics in the United States. So if you are someone who is interested in the narratives around vaccines that are circulating in communities who use these apps to talk, then this is something that, that should probably be on your radar. Another thing that's really important about closed messaging apps is that they're important for access to news, especially in some countries that have programs like Free Basics and Zero Rating. These are programs that essentially allow certain apps to operate freely without using people's data. And so in countries where this is the case, these apps provide a data-free, money-free way to access news, right? And so when you're providing those opportunities, the news that's circulating on those platforms becomes even more important, right? And the rumors that are circulating on those platforms take on a greater significance. And here's some interesting data also about who is using this for access to news. So, we say closed messaging apps are not just another form of SMS, because people are talking in groups and people are using them for news consumption. So this was some interesting data from the Reuters Institute that shows that 53 respondents in Brazil say that they use WhatsApp as a platform for news. And these other figures are quite high as well. Malaysia, 50%, South Africa, 49%. So yeah, they really aren't just another form of SMS. These are platforms that people are using for news consumption and therefore for consumption of information about vaccines. In 2019, Mark Zuckerberg announced what became known as the pivot to privacy, which was a pretty big deal in terms of the life cycle of the platform, at least it was supposed to be. But this also sort of tracked a trend that we were already seeing in terms of people moving to closed messaging apps as an option to avoid monitoring and targeting, as an option to avoid harassment, And in some places, as a way to, avoid legislation that punishes the sharing of false information. There have been fake news laws in certain countries. So these apps provide a more private space for people to share. Following this, something else that happened was that Facebook groups became more prioritized in the algorithm. And so people are seeing Facebook groups more in their news feeds. So as misinformation researchers, that becomes really important because, of course, we're trying to understand the spaces where rumors are circulating, right? And we have seen in all areas of our research that Facebook groups have been so essential to understand when you're trying to track rumors, when you're trying to do counter messaging against misinformation. This is another little interesting piece of data that just shows how many Facebook and WhatsApp users rely on groups function. And in particular in this group on public groups. So public groups where people are interacting with people they don't know. You can see 51% of Facebook users and 46% of WhatsApp users say they use groups. And there's also some interesting data here about how much those people are using those groups for news and politics and are using them for information about their local community. Going back to this idea of privacy, another thing that makes these apps important but distinct is their privacy functions and their encryption. So WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted, but group administrators can create invite links and then those can be posted on the web. Some people don't know this, but if you're in a WhatsApp group and someone posts that group invite link on the web, it essentially becomes public and anyone can join it. WhatsApp is also owned by Facebook. So some people have concerns about the ownership of the data that runs on the platform. There's also Signal. So Signal is end-to-end encrypted. It's also open source. It has self-destructing messages. This is an app that has basically been lauded by tons of security experts as the most secure. So that's what Signal is well known for. Telegram is another popular messaging app. Telegram is not encrypted by default, but it can be turned on in secret mode. We're going to talk about this a little bit more also in another session, but Telegram is something that we pay attention to, especially because of its channels feature, which essentially allows activists or anyone to broadcast information to an unlimited number of people. And those are not encrypted. And then there's WeChat, which does not offer end-to-end encryption at all. So even though we talk about privacy with these apps, there are important differences between them. There are a bunch of challenges with misinformation and messaging apps. One of the challenges is that misinformation travels quickly. A lot of these apps have forwarding features. A lot of them are groups where people who know each other, who feel an intimate connection are sharing information, and people are more likely to trust rumors and misinformation they see from people they are close to, right? So that's an issue. Another issue is the encryption. So encryption makes misinformation really hard to track. We're going to talk about verification in the next session, but we're going to talk a lot about provenance and the importance of finding the original iteration of a rumor. And the nature of these closed messaging apps means that it's basically impossible to identify origins of falsehoods. So that is a big problem when we're trying to understand misinformation on these platforms. I want to talk a little bit about WhatsApp for just a second, because WhatsApp is the most popular messaging platform in the world right now. It has 2 billion monthly active users. It's the most popular messaging app globally. It's the main messaging app in Brazil, in Spain, and India. India is now WhatsApp's largest market in the world. There are more than 400 million, I believe, monthly active users. And it's really important in Latin America as well. So WhatsApp is a platform that we're thinking about a lot. And in particular, we're thinking about it in terms of the kinds of misinformation that is circulating on that platform. So just as an example, in the lead up to the 2020 US election. This was also the year of our census. I saw this flyer get posted in a WhatsApp group that I was in. It is my salsa team, because I dance with a salsa team. And there are a lot of women in this WhatsApp chat who are immigrants to the States, who know other immigrants, some who know undocumented people. And one of them posted this flyer that said, "Urgent community notice, security alert for USA residents. Be warned, there is a group going to homes and pretending to be officials from Home Affairs." So this was actually a rumor that became popular in lots of different countries. It was based on something that actually happened in South Africa, but then got taken out of context and posted in WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups all over the world in different places. And if you're familiar with the US government, you know we don't have a Department of Home Affairs, but we do have a Department of Homeland Security, which is what Home Affairs sounds like. And Homeland Security is the department that's responsible for detaining immigrants. So if you were someone who missed that, this would be very scary. And of course, you know, considering the fact that WhatsApp is a very prominent platform with the Latinx community in the United States, it's the perfect place to spread this rumor if you're trying to spread fear. So that's why looking at a platform like WhatsApp in the US, even though other demographics don't necessarily use it, becomes really important. We also did some really interesting research during the 2018 presidential election in Brazil with our project Comprova, which was a project where we worked with 24 newsrooms. We set up a tip line for people to send in misinformation over a period of 12 weeks. And it was pretty incredible. We received over 100,000 messages. And we learned a lot about how misinformation was circulating on WhatsApp in Brazil in the lead up to that election. One of the things that we learned, which we talked about before, is that visual media still reigns when it comes to misinformation. We talked about this in one of our first sessions, but so much misinformation that we see, including vaccine misinformation, is visual. And you can see from this graph, nearly 50,000 of the messages we received on our Brazilian WhatsApp tip line were images. There were also audio messages as well. And this was interesting. It wasn't one of the most prominent forms, but the thing that's notable about it is we did receive a lot of them. We received 1,642 to be exact. 30 of those audio messages were viral. And they're very difficult to investigate, right? How do you investigate an audio message you receive on WhatsApp, right? It's not the same as seeing a message that you see on Facebook or on Twitter, right? That is a kind of misinformation that we are more used to investigating as researchers. It's easier to investigate, but these WhatsApp messages can be very difficult, especially when it comes to audio and images. One of the main challenges when it comes to misinformation on messaging apps is identifying this concept we call the tipping point. The tipping point is essentially the point at which it becomes worth it to report on misinformation. And you might be thinking, well, it's always worth it to report on misinformation. Not necessarily. And we're going to be talking about this a lot more in our later sessions when we talk about responsible reporting and amplification. But, you know, sometimes a rumor has not spread that much yet, right? And so there is a risk of potentially amplifying it beyond what it would have reached organically, right? So the tipping point is this measuring that we do of the risk that the misinformation poses to the public versus the risk of potentially just amplifying it, right? So we're trying to identify, well, what are the chances that this is going to go viral and actually be really harmful, right? That's hard with closed messaging apps because you can't measure engagement as easily. There isn't a function, right, where you see, oh, this had 2,000 shares, right? This had 10,000 likes, right? Some messaging apps show you how many people viewed a message, but actually, you know, views versus a more proactive engagement, it's a little bit different. So it's very hard to measure. And here were some prominent examples from our Comprova research. So this screenshot showed a false conversation between the former president of Brazil and Fernando Haddad. And in the exchange, they're coordinating attacks on Bolsonaro with one of Brazil's largest newspapers. And this image was shared with us 663 times. So if we didn't have a tip line and we saw this image on WhatsApp, we might think, oh, that's a damaging piece of misinformation, but I'm just seeing it this one time on WhatsApp, right? But the fact that we had a tip line meant that we were able to see how many times that piece of misinformation was shared with us by Brazilians, right? And it was shared 663 times. So that was significant. Jumping into the ethics of monitoring. So we spent quite a bit of time on this and quite a bit of time thinking about this as an organization as well, because if you're going to spend time researching misinformation in messaging apps and other kinds of closed groups, ethics is a really important topic. And it's really important because we have to constantly weigh privacy and people's rights to privacy against the public interest, right? A lot of these messaging apps, even if they're public, even if you're talking about a public group on WhatsApp that anyone can join, still have an expectation of privacy, right? People talk on these platforms, feeling like they are more protected than if they were just posting something publicly on the internet. So whether you're a researcher, whether you're a journalist, whether you're some other kind of public health communicator, that's something you have to think about before you dive into any of these platforms. So these are just some of the questions that we urge anyone who's embarking on this kind of work to ask themselves. One is, what is the size of each closed group you are planning on entering? How does the size of a group affect the expectation of privacy? Would your writing a story expose group members to negative consequences? What is the public interest in your potential story? Maybe there isn't interest. Maybe it's not necessary for you to be in a closed messaging group or some other kind of messaging app channel. Are you planning on entering multiple groups? And what is the minimum number of closed spaces you can enter in order to find the information you need? So always trying to minimize how invasive your practices are if you're doing research that is involving closed messaging apps. I mentioned this just a minute ago, but this expectation of privacy is really important to think about. So here is an example of a Facebook group that is titled Pro-Vaccine Parenting in Santa Cruz County. It's a private group. It has 69 members, which is quite small, right? So that's something that I notice when I'm looking at a group, right? If you look at the about section of this group, it says, this group is for parents, grandparents, caregivers, family, guardians, right? So the group has actually outlined who it's for. So if you're not a parent, guardian, or caregiver in Santa Cruz County, that might give you pause before you enter it, right? I'm sure to some of you, this is second nature. You would think, of course, but there are a lot of people interested in misinformation right now, and there are a lot of people concerned about the damaging, sometimes very harmful rumors that are spreading on closed messaging apps and Facebook groups and other closed spaces. So, so these questions are important to think about. Another thing that is common is initiation questions. So in private groups on Facebook, there are often questions you have to answer before you join, right? So this is an example of New Mexico informed vaccine choice. And it asks you in the second question, do you live in New Mexico, right? So if you are a journalist, for example, and you're trying to do research about, misinformation around vaccines in New Mexico, maybe this is a group that you would be interested in joining. But if you don't live in New Mexico, if you're not part of this community, right? What is your protocol? Are you going to be forthcoming? Are you going to say who you are, right? Does your newsroom have a standard for this, or does the organization you work for have some kind of editorial protocol? And if not, that should probably be a conversation that you have with your colleagues or your editor or your manager or whoever is involved. Another thing that is really important to think about is security, right? So this is true for every platform. It's true for messaging apps. It's true for, platforms we're familiar with, like Facebook and Twitter. It's also true for new platforms that you may be interested in joining. But think about security. Think about the personal details that platforms often ask for. Sometimes it's your name. Sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes it's your identification. It's your phone number. Often when you join a Telegram group, your phone number is displayed, right? So that's something you have to think about if you're going to be joining Telegram groups. That might give you pause. We have a resource that we just recently put on our website. It's called Questions to Consider Before Joining a Platform. This is, I think, particularly relevant to doing research on platforms that you may be familiar with, but it's also relevant to messaging apps. So I encourage you to check it out. It's firstdraftnews.org/training. And we run through a whole bunch of different considerations that should be in your mind before you jump into any new space when you're researching. I want to end with a few news gathering tips. So we talked about ethics, right? Now that we've talked about ethics and you've had a chance to think about some of the important questions you need to be asking before joining a new platform, before doing research on messaging apps, now here are some tips for actually doing that research. So as we said before, consider creating a tip line. I think that this is particularly relevant if you are working with a community that is on a platform that is difficult to monitor. For example, WeChat is a very difficult platform to monitor. It's very tedious. Even Telegram is in some respects. So if you are, if you're working with a community who is using a platform that's difficult to monitor as their primary way of communicating, and if misinformation is an issue on that platform, consider creating a tip line. Tip line is a great way to understand how misinformation is circulating without being invasive, without being in groups where you're not actually really a part of that community. So if you have the resources to do that, I certainly recommend it. This is a great little program that the app Line has, which is a popular app in Japan. And users, this quote from Andrew Deck and Victoria Elliott for Rest of the World is a great summary of it, but they say, users can choose to share messages from their encrypted chats with Line's fact-checking account. If the piece of information has already been checked by one of Line's fact-checking partners, the user will automatically receive a message indicating the information is true, partially true, or false. So this is a program that the app itself started, but similar to the project that we did with Comprova and to what some other news organizations we work with have done, you can set a tip line up yourself, as a way to also build trust with your community, right? As a way to reach out to audiences. And, it can be multifunctional. You can use tip lines to reach audiences that are more likely to be targeted. It's an opportunity to partner with grassroots groups, community orgs, libraries, and generally build trust. Of course, if you joined our previous sessions, you know that when it comes to vaccine misinformation, trust is a very big issue. A lot of people want to have accurate health information, but they're concerned about the people who are providing information. They're concerned about the politics involved, about the profit involved, right? So if you can find opportunities to build trust with communities, that will help you a lot. In terms of very practical tips that you can implement now, here are a couple of ideas that our team uses all the time. Site searches. So we talked a little bit about site searches in our monitoring session, but you can do a site search for Telegram channels by searching for this URL, t.me. If you search for this URL t.me and then you add your search terms like vaccine side effects, for example, that will pull up public Telegram channels that you can view in your web browser that have to do with those keywords. One of the things that you might have to do is scroll down to the bottom of the screen, and Google actually omits some of the search results. So you have to repeat the search with the omitted results included. And then that will give you more expansive results. The thing that's great about this is that it means that you don't actually need to join the channels to view them. Telegram gives you the option of previewing channels, so you just have to know to look out for that little option. You can also search for WhatsApp group invites, and you can do this by typing in chat.whatsapp.com and your keywords. So here we have vacuna, which of course is the Spanish word for vaccine. Google doesn't index these URLs for privacy reasons, but you can search them on Twitter or Facebook or Reddit, and you will find results. If you would like to learn more, you should check out our closed groups and messaging apps essential guide. It is on our website. It's free. Go to firstdraftnews.com/training, and we provide all of the tips that are in this session and a whole lot more. We also talk about political ads. We talk a little bit more about Facebook groups as well. So if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to check it out.